on. When you're not speaking, turn it off. And always try and stay about 6 to 9 inches away from the microphone.
Right here?
Yeah. Did you get on? On, about 6 inches away is perfect.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you and welcome for joining us to this important event. We want to acknowledge the nearly 100 Indigenous representatives who met with us in Geneva on October 8th to 10th to define our vision of the just transition, one that is rooted in Indigenous values and that prioritizes the well-being of people and the planet. Just transition efforts are ramping up everywhere, from extraction of transition minerals, renewable energy technologies, and more. This is why we need to lay out our vision of what a just transition rooted in Indigenous values looks like. Last year also, countries agreed to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030, which means that more projects may encroach on the lands of Indigenous peoples, as well as extraction projects may go on. We want to be very clear, and we have one message today. Any project that proceeds without obtaining Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent does not constitute a just transition. Today, we have speakers who joined us in Geneva to shape this vision of a just transition. And so I will not be able to introduce you, but please introduce yourself when you speak. And if you have any questions at the end of the press conference, please let us know who you are and tell us your question. So first we have Rodion Sulianciga here to my right. Please explain the context that we are in and why we needed to come together to speak about the just transition, and talk to us about the outcome document. What's in it?
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rodion Sulianciga. I am an indigenous person from the Russian Eastern Siberia, and I was honored to chair the summit taking place in Geneva recently. If you look at the back, the Paris Agreement, Indigenous peoples was one of the vocal and taking a leadership to promote shifting from fossil fuels to so-called green economy. But the process we started 2 years ago to identify our position. What does it mean, just transition for Indigenous peoples? And we have 3 specific goals at the summit in Geneva. The first one, to bring together all 7 social-cultural regions, from Amazon to the Arctic. And we got together around 100 delegates from each region. And the second point, that was the main outcome of the summit, to develop a unified position on how Indigenous peoples envision and contribute to so-called just transition towards green economy. And the second goal was to create a dialogue space with other stakeholders. And we have identified some key topics. The first one, Indigenous values and vision based on our principles, and to define what is just transition for Indigenous peoples. The second big topic, critical minerals and green economy. And the third one, global south and global north, inequities in the just transition. What we have found, and it raises a very difficult question, is the green economy just another chapter in the story of colonization? And of course, the answer is also quite complicated. But one thing is undeniable. The clean energy transition is not going away. That means we should be prepared well, and we should find our own solution. The so-called green revolution heavily relies on raw materials, including nickel, cobalt, lithium, that are still extracted from indigenous land. And in conclusion, we must commit the future where the green economy does not come at the expense of indigenous rights and their land. We cannot claim to be saving the planet while sacrificing its most dedicated guardians. The path to a green future must be built on justice, respect, and the protection of indigenous land and their rights. Anything less is not a progress, it's exploitation under a different name. And finally, just transition starts where the indigenous rights begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodion. If you would like to have access to the document, the outcome document, the QR code is there. I realize it's really small, but please get closer if you would like to do that. Next, we have Sarah Olsvig at the end of the table. Thank you. And we would like to know what are the impacts and threats of current clean, renewable energy projects in your territory in the Arctic. And secondly, the outcome document of the summit contains a vision and meaning of just transition for indigenous peoples. What does a just transition look like for indigenous peoples?
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just going to say clearly now that I have not been at the Just Transition Summit in Geneva, but we had a very big delegation of Inuit and Sami that constitute the Arctic region in the 7 socio-cultural regional system that we operate with in the UN as indigenous peoples. I am the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council that brings together Inuit from across 4 very different nation states: Kalaalleq, Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka, Russia. The Sami also live across 4 very different nation states: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. We as an Arctic region are deeply affected by climate change. We are seeing heavy flooding of whole towns and settlements in Alaska. The coastal erosion is massive, changing the nature, changing the coastlines, dragging away hunting equipment and hunting huts, and severely damaging our infrastructure across the line. In Kalaalleq, we have experienced how the sea ice doesn't settle, taking away the access to hunting. And generally, we have been among those indigenous peoples who for many, many decades have brought the message of the climate changing to the UN, to the mainstream media for many, many decades. And we continue to do so. Now, on top of the climate changes, we are seeing a race for resources that is based on a sort of mainstream approach that is talking about the greater good. And I want to challenge everyone who deals with these resource races to look at this and grasp the diversity and complexities of the nations and peoples of the world. Inuit and Sami do not necessarily all have the same approaches to just transition because each of their realities are so different. In Sápmi, we are seeing how so-called green energy projects with big wind industry farms is actually a land grabbing of Sami reindeer husbandry areas, and is actually happening by violating the civil and political rights of Sami people in Norway. And we have seen how the Supreme Court of Norway has ruled that this was not in line with the Constitution of Norway, but still the wind farms and the wind industry is there. For Inuit, we want to be miners, we want to develop resources, but we want it to happen based on our inherent right of self-determination. And here I want to come back to what Rodion was saying about colonization and the doctrine of discovery. We must be so careful as a global society that the race for resources in the name of green, so-called green transition, doesn't happen at the cost of the fundamental human rights of all indigenous peoples. And here the basic principle is the right of self-determination as a prerequisite for the enjoyment of all other rights. And this document clearly talks about the obligation of obtaining the free, prior, informed consent of the indigenous peoples whose land a project is going on prior to the approval of any project. That is the right that is affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which also must be implemented throughout all chains of so-called green or cleaner transition. So I fully echo what has been said and also what has been now stated clearly in this document, that there's no justice if we talk about just transition, if this justice happens with the violation of the rights of indigenous peoples, and particularly for indigenous peoples. This is a thing that we cannot avoid talking about with everyone else on the planet because of history, because of colonization, because of being globally marginalized in decision-making processes. So that's why it's so important that we are here. That's why it's so important that we continue to question justice for whom when we talk about justice, and that we are able to understand the diversities and complexities around the world, especially for indigenous peoples. I just want to end by saying that parallel to this work, the UN Secretary General himself called for us being able to collectively to look at what is justice in transition. And the work of his panel, the UN Secretary's panel on critical energy transition minerals, is another document that has many of the same principles instated in it when it was finalized in September. And tomorrow it will be presented high level. And here I think that one focus that is so particular in this panel's work is also the focus on the rights of indigenous peoples. So we must continue that at every venue that we can do that on.
Thank you. We'll next have Nicole Maria Yanes from NDN Collective, and to speak about one of the cases that could impact indigenous peoples. Please talk to us about Plan de Sonora. What is it? What are the threats to indigenous peoples from this proposed plan? And secondly, the outcome document contains 11 principles for just transition. Please tell us more about those principles.
Thank you, Econao. Really good to be here with all of you. Actually, Plan de Sonora was a project and the climate solution that Mexico and the United States proposed as their climate solution in COP29 in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. And that's where I learned it in a press conference, and they were talking about our territories back home and opening the largest lithium mine in the world, an investment from the United States of America of $50 billion into Mexico, factories, energy production, solar panels, et cetera, right? A whole model that the governments have said that they would continue to expand into Mexico, right? And so we're seeing a big geopolitical power war, for example, between China and the United States back at home in indigenous territories in Mexico. So, you know, there's different investors, different investments, private investments, right, who are really targeting our lands, our waters, our territories, therefore our people, and are violating our rights. And so that's what's happening with these agreements that are made in spaces like this. And as Sarah was mentioning, it's not the solution, this greenwashing, this just transition, green economy, carbon market trading, all that. It's not the solution, and it's only leading to further displacements of indigenous peoples, further violation of our rights, and using the waters and the resources and the minerals of the future generations, because those are not even for us to be using. The aquifers for mining, the aquifer waters in the desert where we're already facing drought, to be opening them up for corporations in the name of renewable energy and in the name of climate solutions. So that's the battles that we're facing back home. And therefore, we're facing all our repercussions as land defenders, right? So we talked about this in Geneva. We talked about all these different mega projects. We're seeing the similarities of indigenous peoples around the world facing the same companies, facing the same tactics and strategies from these multi-corporation companies and governments who are heavily relying on the militarization of the governments against their people. So some of the principles that were mentioned in Geneva for just transition are indigenous people's rights. Just transition must be based on the totality of implementing our inherent rights that are mentioned in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the recognition of our roles and responsibilities as indigenous peoples, as caretakers of Mother Earth, indigenous peoples' knowledge, decolonization. You can read more about them, but in the sake of time, that's why I'm gonna go through them more quickly. Maintaining the 1.5 to participation. Just transition must include and reflect the input and participation, full participation of indigenous peoples. Land back. Just transition must begin with the restoration, recognition, and respect of our rights, waters, and other resources. And these also includes the restoration of our inherent sovereignty, our economies, our jurisdiction, our languages, our food production. Land back. Transparency and accountability. This is really important because this is what we're here for in the negotiations. Just transition must ensure that full transparency regarding resources and sources of funding of investors in these projects. And we're seeing it with the new quantified goals and climate finance in Article 6, right? We need full transparency of where these funds will be coming from, and we cannot move away from this public funding because of the carbon markets and private funding. So,
thank you so much. We'll now go to Asia with Buddha. So the question is, what are the impacts also of these projects that are being developed under the umbrella of the energy transition, of the just transition in Asia? And how do you see these 11 principles being implemented into policies that support the rights of indigenous peoples?
Thank you, Brian. I am Buddha Garthi from Nepal. I am Senior Vice Chairperson of Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, NEFIN. I was also participating in Just Summit in Geneva. Asia, largest continent with huge diversity of language, culture, resources, geography, yes, of course. And we are talking about green energy, green finance, green jobs, green opportunities. But in the name of green opportunities and green energy, the diversity and the recognition of the indigenous peoples is being abolished and forced to abandon their ancestral land by the state of the name of the modern development, in the name of conservation and in the name of green energy. Of course, COP29 commit countries to triple renewable capacity and bring clean energy to all by 2030. India stands fourth globally in renewable energy installed capacity. The country has a target of 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel-based energy by 2030. In one location of India, where at least 47% of indigenous peoples are residing, found 5.9 megaton lithium, and the state is going to extract that minerals. And China has forecasted to spend around $800 billion by 2030 to modernize the transmission grid and its software. China has 1,200 gigawatts of installed solar and wind capacity. 2/3 of all new solar and wind power projects are under construction. In the case of Nepal, Nepal is expecting to generate 28,000 megawatt hydroelectric power by 2035. However, currently, it has only 3,000 megawatt hydroelectric power. And more than 250 hydroelectric power project, hydro power, they are under construction. This is a very small figure of Asian energy workout. There are many other projects which are under construction. And we have the question that all the things, all the projects, they are going to generate and to ensure the green energy. But we have a challenge, we have a threat of the indigenous people's rights, issues, and self-determination, and of course, our ancestral land, which our indigenous peoples are forcibly evicted from their ancestral land. In Nepal, Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, are strongly advocating for right to self-determination. Nepal is the one among 24 countries which has ratified the ILO 169, and it has endorsed UNRIP 2007. But still, the state is not willing to ensure the pre-prior and informed consent. There are more than 250 hydropower under construction, but only few, not more than 5 hydropower projects, they are following the pre-prior and informed consent, a PIC. Just transition could not rely on false solutions. Just should be acknowledged by the indigenous world view. It should be based on the indigenous science and indigenous knowledge, ensuring the right to self-determination. In the case of Nepal and also in Asia, we are facing, the indigenous peoples are facing implementation of pre-prior and informed consent. The state and the authority of the state, they think that pre-prior and informed consent is only the burden. It is the extra burden. It is just hindering the project. It is just making the investors far away. That is why they have a misconception of pre-prior and informed consent. That is why most of the indigenous peoples, they have been evicted. They have been displaced, and the recognition that is being erased, the history of the indigenous peoples, it has been erased. And okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Finally, we have Janine Yassi, we also want to ask you, what are the impacts in North America of these projects being developed under the umbrella of the Just Transition? And please talk to us about the 10 commitments for actions in the outcome document.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk and speak to the experiences of indigenous peoples in North America, because I think in these spaces we often think of these systemic injustices as something that only happens outside of so-called developed nations. But the reality is that the root of these injustices and the structures that perpetuate them come from developed nations, and indigenous peoples have from the beginning been grappling with the inequalities, the systemic oppressions, and the threats that these continue to pose to our lands, territories, and our sacred elements in our communities. one of the problems across the board that many of my colleagues are describing is that as we are talking about the importance to transition and what a just transition looks like, we are not asking some of the fundamental questions about what we are producing energy for and whether or not we are challenging an unsustainable manufactured dependency on our energy consumption. And as a result, not only have Indigenous peoples' lands been used as resource colonies for our current energy infrastructure and energy needs, but with this transition to renewable energy without taking a rights-based approach, without using a decolonial lens to understand the root of the problems that have gotten us to this position, what we're seeing is just further violation of Indigenous peoples' rights in the form of land grabs to promote large-scale renewable energy projects, and in the form of another type of taking in order to mine critical minerals, or so-called transition minerals, in Indigenous territories, sacred places, and precious ecosystems that can't afford these attacks on top of the impacts of climate change in many of our precious ecosystems. And so what we're presenting in terms of these principles and how they need to be applied is not just a model that benefits Indigenous peoples. It is a model that benefits all of our ecosystems, all of our communities, all of our nations. And it's a call to action to ensure that we are taking an approach that truly is rooted in what justice means. And what justice means in this time is returning a wholeness to ourselves, doing what we need to do to restore all that has been destroyed, all that has been harmed, and doing that until all that is sacred is restored. And so from this concept, what we're hoping is that we're calling people into a practice of both recognizing the root causes of the issues that we're dealing with, as well as the pathways available to us to ensure that we are taking a holistic, comprehensive approach to how and why we are developing energy, the ways that we do that using a rights-based framework throughout the entire supply chain, and ensuring that we aren't duped into false solutions or so-called transitional energy models that promote things like nuclear energy, which is going to increase the demand for uranium mining and pollution and contamination we don't have the technology or the solutions to solve. And so this is a call to action for all of us, for all of life, for all that is sacred, and for our future generations, because we can and we will do better. And Indigenous peoples will continue to hold that front line of what it means when we talk about just transition, because we want just transformation.
Thank you so much. It's a pity we won't be able to receive your questions, but the Indigenous leaders will be outside if you'd like to ask any questions yourself after. Thank you so much for this space, and we hope you have a good day.
One. No?